the Beatles. We have John Lennon, who's a singer-songwriter, vocalist, rhythm guitar. We have Paul McCartney, singer-songwriter, vocalist, bass player, and piano. Now, Stu Sutcliffe was the original bass player. We have George Harrison, singer-songwriter, lead guitarist. The original drummer of the Beatles, his name is Pete Best. Ringo Starr, the drummer that we know. We talk about the Fab Four as being John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. Brian Epstein, he was the Beatles manager. And George Martin is the guy that ran Parlophone, EMI Parlophone, signed the Beatles, and also made quite a few really cool, interesting suggestions on particular songs and albums, on certain things they could do artistically and musically. Let's talk about the stories of the members. John Winston Lennon, born in Liverpool, England, on October 9th, 1940. John's mother, her name was Julia. Julia was really happy, fun-loving, carefree. Within, about a year of John Lennon's birth, she left her husband. John Lennon's father, he was a ship steward, wasn't home that much, and so John was, really his Aunt Mimi, which was Julia's sister, and John's Uncle George. It really became kind of, those are the people that raised him pretty much. John Lennon was rebellious and iconoclastic, and he'd been known to, kind of be rough and gruff around the edges sometimes, and would push back on authority figures. John did like to read, though, and he would read, he'd write, create and write poems, short stories, drawings. He was kind of trying to find himself and figure some things out, and the whole short story and poem thing, it definitely starts to resonate and make sense when you really dig into all those lyrics. There was a impishness that kind of progressed through mischievousness, and this led to mild delinquency. He was rebellious. John was very outspoken, so much so that it probably got him in trouble in times. When John Lennon says, the Beatles are, more popular than Jesus Christ. That got a lot of people angry, for sure. We look at, say, around 1955, Uncle George passes away suddenly. John struggles with that and starts to become a burden on Aunt Mimi. John Lennon's grades, they start to drop. He gets way more rebellious and more troublesome. You move over to 1956, and you have John hears Elvis Presley. And he's mesmerized by Elvis Presley. And he's like, wow, man, this Elvis guy is, he's digging it. He's digging it for sure. And John gets a guitar. He gets a hold of something. At the time, the BBC declined to play rock and roll. And so it made it a real challenge for John or anybody to find, this Elvis Presley guy is, incredible. Oh, my gosh, what are we supposed to do now? All right, so there was an independent radio station. This is Luxembourg, if I'm saying that right. And John listened constantly, and he was able to hear all the rock kind of stuff that he wanted to hear. If you find older pictures of John Lennon, you'll see greasy hair, ducktail, a pointed slight of hair in front, maybe some tight drainpipe pants. John started really getting into different kind of music. Lonnie Donegan smash hit called Rock Island Line, really representing this whole skiffle style, it's a simple 3-chord style, and it features an instrumental lineup of guitar and or banjo. You have some homemade instruments like a washboard, play with a thimble-capped fingers, and then bass made from a broom handle, wooden chest, and a tightly strung wire. So it's some interesting kind of makeshift, things happening with that particular style, but it was captivating for a lot of people at the time. John organizes his own skiffle group. They call it the Quarrymen. John wants to call it Quarrymen because it's named after Quarry Bank High School. That's where John went to school. And so they played both skiffle and they played rock and roll. And this is probably July or so of 1957, they were playing at a garden party. And this is when one of the bandmates in the group, his name was Ivan Vaughan. Ivan Vaughan introduces John Lennon to his friend from the Liverpool Institute, and this guy's name is, you guessed it, Paul McCartney. Ivan is in the Quarrymen at the time with John Lennon and some others. Ivan is the guy basically in the middle. He's the connector. John Lennon and Paul McCartney haven't met yet. Once that connection is made, some serious sparks and magic awesomeness happens. Then at some point, Paul shows John what he can do and just starts throwing down like some Little Richard songs, and John's blown away. After several days, John does invite Paul to join the group. Paul McCartney is, he's got a little bit of a different upbringing. When we look at Paul McCartney, James Paul McCartney, he's born on June 18th, 1942. He really excels in, say, like English composition and art. He was very successful in school and academics and grades. And at around 14, Paul's family, it was a really heartbreaking kind of moment in the family because it was the death of Mary McCartney, Paul's mother. Paul McCartney loses his mom at 14, and they're all devastated. Paul's father, Jim, he had a society band in the 1920s. Paul's father's musical background, this is a huge influence on the McCartney home. Now, the skiffle thing I was talking about earlier, the skiffle rage, like it hit Britain pretty hard. And, Jim, this is his dad, Paul's dad, gets him a guitar. Paul starts imitating the vocal and guitar styles of Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Carl Perkins, and the Everly Brothers. So these are big influences on Paul McCartney. Musicians, artists get inspiration from other artists. John was like a huge Elvis Presley guy. Paul McCartney was like Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Carl Perkins, Everly Brothers. But there's probably some of those that, John was pretty hip to as well. If we take a look at George Harrison. George Harrison, he's born February 25th, 1943. George meets Paul at the Liverpool Institute in around, I believe, 1954. Like John, George resented formal education, didn't do that great in school, and had that teddy boy look, kind of, sort of. George's mom gets him a guitar, and George starts teaching himself to play. The interesting thing about this part of the story is when you look at, okay, well, how did George even get into the group? What's the story behind that? The connector in this particular one would be Paul McCartney, because Paul and George are friends, but also Paul McCartney and John Lennon, of course, are good friends and already playing together in the band. But George isn't there yet. So Paul introduces George Harrison, to John and the group, and George shows a few patterns and things and just a few skills that he can do. And in the beginning, John looked kind of down on him, like a bit condescending, because at the time, George Harrison is 14 years old, and probably around that time, George was maybe a little somber and introverted, or maybe that's just the way like John saw him. But John tolerated George Harrison because he was Paul McCartney's friend, and of course he got into the band. And the real story is like Stu is the original bass player. There's a lot of talk in the history about Stu basically performing with his back to the audience. First of all, he was still learning how to play for a little bit, and this is before the Beatles, really. Stu and John, they're close, good friends, and Stu's actually not in the band yet. Stu's one of the most talented students at the art college. He's a very talented art student. He's gifted at art, but some would say Stu is a little bit antisocial. Stu looked and dressed and acted the part of like a counterculture brooding artist. So for many, it does kind of seem that it's a pretty good fit, good vibe that, him and John do become friends. Stu gets a bass guitar and he's determined to join John's group, but he didn't know how to play, like nothing, not at all. He did not know how to play. John doesn't even have to think about it. It's like, sure, yeah, join the band. They're really good friends, and hey, why not? Let's do it. There is a tragic accident where we lose Stu, and he passes away. Paul ends up switching to learn the bass and take over in that area. Well, they start off as like the Quarrymen, Quarry Bank High School, John and Ivan and a few other people, and then you end up, Ivan brings over, Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney brings in George Harrison. Stu is in that mix as well. Who's the person in the record books that actually came up with the idea of like naming? Well, it was Stu's. John and Stu are chilling. Stu says, "How about the Silver Beatles?" John thinks for a moment, and John's like, "Well, what if we try Long John and the Silver Beatles?" He's kind of fascinated with, I guess what you'd call wordplay, and we're going to just misspell this on purpose, and, I guess you maybe view it as, a punning on the word, possibly. But the Beatles, part of that conversation was both Stu Sutcliffe and John Lennon, they liked groups, say, like Buddy Holly and the Crickets, Little Richard and, Elvis Presley and the Everly Brothers, and Buddy Holly and the Crickets was a part of that too.